So today we're going to dig into a really different and, I think, powerful way of thinking about right and wrong. It's a perspective that comes from feminist philosophy and an idea called the ethic of care. And it really makes you question the foundations of morality as we know it. So let's explore this together.
And it all kicks off with a really simple but profound question. When we're deciding what's good or what's just, whose point of view are we actually using? Who gets to set the rules for the whole debate? This question, it's really at the heart of everything we're talking about today.
And this isn't a new idea. Think about it. Over 90 years ago, Virginia Woolf pointed out that the values we often treat as just universal are actually shaped by a very specific masculine perspective. This insight perfectly sets the stage for why a whole new way of thinking about ethics wasn't just an option, but an absolute necessity.
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the historical voice that's dominated morality. Then we'll dive into how feminism challenged that. We'll listen for that different voice with a classic ethical dilemma, see how this all applies to the real world, and then finally pull it all together.
Okay, so first things first. To really get why a new approach was so revolutionary, we have to understand the one that was the default for centuries. It's kind of wild when you look back. For thousands of years, some of the biggest names in philosophy, we're talking Aristotle, Rousseau, Kant, they built these incredible ethical systems that either directly or indirectly basically said women's thinking was different, and usually not as good. And these weren't just footnotes. These were core ideas that shaped laws, society, and our whole concept of what a moral person is supposed to be.
And this, right here, is where feminist philosophy steps onto the scene. It comes in and challenges that whole idea of a single, universal morality by asking a really critical question. Who gets left out when we build our ethics around this one, male-centered point of view?
Feminist thinkers like Alison Jagger started pointing out that traditional ethics had these huge blind spots. It often dismissed the moral dilemmas of the private world, stuff happening in the home, with family, caregiving, as if it wasn't as important. It celebrated abstract rules and being impartial, while undervaluing things like our connections to each other, community, and emotion, which, surprise, surprise, were often the very center of women's moral lives.
So, what does this actually look like in practice? Well, there's nothing that makes this clash of worldviews clearer than a famous psychological puzzle known as the Heinz dilemma.
Okay, so here's the setup, which came from psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. Picture this. A man's wife is dying. There's a drug that can save her, but the pharmacist is charging a fortune for it, way more than it costs to make. Heinz just can't afford it. The question is, should he steal the drug? It's a classic moral test.
Now here's where it gets fascinating. When two 11-year-olds were asked this, their answers were totally different. Jake jumps right to a universal rule. A human life is worth more than money. Boom, problem solved like a math equation. But Amy, she hesitates. Her brain goes somewhere else entirely. She sees a tangled mess of relationships. She says they should talk, because what happens if Heinz goes to jail and his wife needs him? Now, in Kohlberg's original system, Jake's abstract logic was seen as more morally advanced.
But then psychologist Carol Gilligan came along with her game-changing book In a Different Voice, and she basically said, hold on a minute. She argued that Amy wasn't less developed, she was just speaking a completely different moral language. It was a language based not on abstract principles, but on relationships, on empathy, on caring for others. And that is the very foundation of care ethics.
This table just breaks it down so clearly. On one side, you've got the ethic of principle. It's all about impartial duty, rights, and finding universal rules. The focus is on the individual. But on the other side, the ethic of care is all about relationships and specific needs. The reasoning is contextual, empathetic, and the whole goal is to maintain trust and connection. They're two totally different ways of navigating the moral world.
Okay, so this is way more than just some abstract theory. Let's bring this down to earth and see how looking through the lens of care ethics completely changes how we see real, tangible social issues, especially ones tied to gender. When you start using a care ethics framework, all these things that might have been brushed off as personal problems suddenly become massive moral concerns. We're talking about the huge amount of unpaid work that happens in the home, the emotional heavy lifting that women are often expected to do, workplace inequality. These stop being just economic issues and become deeply ethical ones.
So how does it reframe them? Well, first, it starts by valuing our interdependence. It reminds us that nobody gets through life alone.
Second, it demands that we seek caring work, that emotional labor, not as some soft skill or given, but as a real moral and economic strength. And third, it pushes for something called relational justice, which is all about creating fairness within the very relationships that hold our society together.
And this leads to a really crucial point. For care to be a real, genuine moral act, it has to be a choice. As thinkers like Sheila Mullet argue, you can't have true care when one person has all the power and the other has none. That insight is huge. It transforms care from just a private feeling into a public demand for justice and for equality.
So where does all this leave us? How do we take these two distinct voices, the voice of justice and the voice of care, and put them together to get a better, more complete picture of what it means to be a good person?
Well, the modern thinking from philosophers like Virginia Held and Annette Beyer isn't that care should replace justice. Not at all. The idea is that justice can't even get off the ground without care. I mean, to even start thinking about what's fair, you have to first care about what happens to someone else. Care is the starting line.
So the core ideas of this modern ethic of care are pretty straightforward. First, it recognizes we're all connected. We aren't just isolated atoms bouncing around. Second, it insists that we have to give special thought to the people who are most vulnerable to our choices. And third, it reminds us that context, the real, messy details of life always matters.
And this leads to such a beautiful and powerful idea, relational autonomy. It completely flips that old idea of the rugged individual on its head. It says that our ability to be independent, to be our own person, doesn't come from cutting ourselves off from everyone else. Actually, it's made possible because of the supportive, caring relationships that hold us up.
So, I want to leave you with a big question to think about. What if? What if our laws, our economic policies, our entire social structure, what if they weren't just built around abstract ideas of rights, but were actually designed with the value of care at their absolute center? What kind of world would that be?
Because at the end of the day, what feminism and the ethics of care really show us is that morality doesn't start with one person alone in a room figuring out universal rules. It starts in the space between people. It begins with our connections and our responsibilities to each other. And it's right there, in those relationships, that a simple act of care can become the most profound act of justice.